Funerals are supposed to be quiet, filled with mourning and respect. But mine was nothing like that. The church was silent, people dressed in black, whispers floating through the air like ghosts. And then, out of nowhere, my own sister walked up to me, her face twisted with rage, and slapped me across the face in front of everyone. The sound echoed through the room, sharper than the priest's voice, louder than the cries of grief. For a moment, no one breathed. All eyes turned to me, the shame burning across my cheek. She leaned in and hissed, "You don't belong here. You've always been a disgrace." Her words cut deeper than her hand. At that moment, I saw the smirks of a few relatives who had always doubted me, who had always whispered that I was nothing more than a failure. And I felt the weight of years of silence, years of letting others define who I was, but what my sister, and everyone else in that room, didn't know was that I wasn't the man they thought I was. The uniform I wore under my black coat, the medals resting quietly in my pocket, and the battles I had fought in silence told a story none of them had ever cared to ask, so I stood tall. My cheek still stung, but my spirit didn't bend. If she wanted the world to see me as a disgrace, then I would show them the truth instead, because I wasn't just a man at a funeral. I was a decorated officer. A soldier who had bled for his country. And this time, I wasn't going to stay silent. That funeral would not just be remembered for grief, it would be remembered as the day I showed everyone who I truly was. The air inside the church was heavy, the kind of heavy that pressed against your chest and made it hard to breathe, as though the weight of grief itself had settled on every pew. Muffled sobs filled the silence, broken only by the occasional cough or shuffle of shoes against the stone floor. My father's coffin lay at the front, draped in white lilies, and yet my mind wasn't at peace. The truth is, I hadn't spoken much to my family in years, and though I stood there dressed in black, my heart carried the weight of more than just loss. I could feel the eyes of relatives drilling into me, some filled with sympathy, others with judgment. That was when Claire, my sister, made her move. She had been glaring at me the entire service, her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. It was no secret that she despised me. To her, I had been the son who left, the one who turned his back on family when duty called, the one who disappeared into the world of soldiers and wars while she stayed behind, caring for our parents. She had never forgiven me, and she never missed a chance to remind me of it. Still, I wasn't prepared for what she did next. As the priest lowered his head in prayer and the crowd grew silent, Claire stood abruptly, her heels clicking like gunshots against the wooden floor as she walked straight toward me. I saw the fury burning in her eyes, but I stayed still, unwilling to create a scene during our father's final goodbye. Without a word of warning, her hand shot across my face, striking me so hard that the sharp crack echoed through the church like a thunderclap. My cheek burned, and for a split second the world around me froze. Gasps filled the room. My mother flinched and lowered her gaze. An elderly aunt whispered in shock. The children in the front row stared wide-eyed as though they had just witnessed some terrible crime. Claire leaned closer, her voice a venomous hiss meant for me but loud enough for everyone to hear, "You don't belong here. You've always been a disgrace." Those words pierced deeper than her hand ever could, cutting through the years of silence and sacrifice I had endured. I stood there, my face stinging, my pride stung even worse, as the whispers spread like wildfire. To many of them, I had always been a mystery, an enigma who left and rarely returned, who never explained where he had been or what he had seen. Now, with Claire's accusation, I could almost feel them believing her, nodding silently to themselves, as if her slap had confirmed every rumor, every doubt they had ever harbored about me. For a moment, I felt like I was a child again, standing in the shadow of their expectations, the boy who could never measure up, the one who was always compared to someone better, someone stronger. Rage threatened to rise inside me, but I pressed it down. I had learned long ago on battlefields that emotion, if unchecked, could be more dangerous than a bullet. So instead of retaliating, I simply stood there, meeting her glare with silence. My sister's chest rose and fell with sharp breaths, and her face twisted into something cruel, as if she thought she had won, as if my silence confirmed her words. But what she, and every person in that room, didn't know was that silence was not weakness. My silence held a truth so heavy it could crush every false judgment they had ever placed on me. Beneath my coat, pressed close to my chest, was the uniform I had worn into deserts where the sun blistered skin, into jungles where the air itself tried to suffocate you, into mountains where the cold could freeze a man's will to live. In my pocket was a small wooden box holding medals that bore testimony to years of sacrifice, pain, and courage. They were not symbols of glory but of blood spilled, lives lost, and nights haunted by memories too dark to share. But to my family, to Claire, none of that mattered. They had never asked. They had never cared. To them, I was just the son who left, the brother who abandoned, the man who was never there when they thought they needed him most. And as I stood there in that church with my father's coffin before me and my sister's handprint burning on my cheek, I realized something. This was not just about grief. This was about truth. For too long, I had allowed others to paint me with their words, to define me by their ignorance. For too long, I had let my silence be mistaken for shame. But no more. That day, in that church, I made a silent promise. If she wanted the world to see me as a disgrace, then I would show them the truth instead. Not with anger. Not with violence. But with proof that would silence every whisper and crush every doubt. I lifted my eyes to the coffin, to the man who had taught me that honor was not in words but in deeds, and I felt his presence steady me. My father had been respected by all, a man of discipline and quiet strength, and I knew in my heart that he would not have wanted me to shrink in the face of lies. He would have wanted me to stand. So I did. My cheek still burned, but my spirit did not bend. I stood tall, my back straight, my eyes clear. And though I said nothing, my silence carried a weight heavier than Claire's anger. The church was no longer just a place of mourning, it was about to become a stage where the truth would finally be revealed. The church was still tense after the slap, the silence stretched thin like a wire ready to snap, and though I stood motionless, my mind was burning with memories I had tried for years to bury. Claire's words echoed in my skull, "You don't belong here. You've always been a disgrace." The sting on my cheek was nothing compared to the sting of those words because they pulled me back into every doubt, every whispered rumor, every sideways glance I had endured since I left home. To my sister, I had been the coward who abandoned family responsibilities, who missed birthdays, who missed our mother's sickness, who wasn't there to help carry the burden she shouldered alone. She never saw the nights I slept in sandstorms, the days I went without water, the men I watched take their last breaths while I pressed my hands to wounds that couldn't be closed. She never saw how much of myself I had left behind in the fields of war. In her mind, absence meant weakness, meant selfishness, and nothing could change her perception. But the others in the church, the extended family, the neighbors who had known us since childhood, the old friends of my father, they looked at me with wide eyes, their curiosity growing, their whispers swelling as they tried to understand what had just unfolded. I could feel the pressure building inside my chest, a storm pushing against my ribs. I had learned to hold silence as a shield in the military. Silence in the field meant survival. But here, silence was turning into a noose. My hand slipped into my coat pocket almost by instinct, brushing against the smooth wooden box I carried. It was small, ordinary on the outside, but the weight of what it contained was enough to shift the balance of the entire room. Slowly, I drew it out. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Even Claire, who had been standing defiantly with her chin raised, faltered slightly when she saw me place the box atop our father's coffin. My fingers hesitated on the latch, but then I opened it, revealing the medals gleaming under the dim light. They weren't just decorations. Each one was a piece of my soul, earned through fire and blood. The silver star for gallantry in action. The purple heart for wounds suffered in battle. 2 distinguished service crosses for acts that had nearly cost me my life. Gasps echoed around the church as the glint of the medals caught every eye. For the first time since I walked in, the silence wasn't heavy with judgment, it was charged with shock, awe, and confusion. I straightened my shoulders, feeling the familiar steel of discipline return to my spine, and spoke, not loudly, but with the steady calm of a man who has nothing left to hide. "You call me a disgrace," I said, my voice directed at Claire. "But meant for everyone. But while you were here judging my absence, I was halfway across the world carrying men off battlefields so they could see their families again. I've bled for this country. I've held brothers in my arms as they took their last breath. I've lived through nights so dark, the only light I had was the memory of this family I was fighting to protect." The words spilled out not as a performance but as truth, raw and unpolished. I saw the priest lower his head, his hands trembling. My mother lifted her gaze for the first time since the slap, her eyes glistening, her lips parted in disbelief. The whispers in the crowd shifted from judgment to awe. People who had known me as a boy now looked at me as if they were seeing a stranger, someone they had never truly known. But Claire, oh Claire, her face twisted, torn between anger and the undeniable reality staring her in the face. She had spent years building her version of me, feeding on her resentment, convincing herself and everyone else that I was a failure. And now, in the span of moments, that image was cracking, splintering under the weight of metals that she could not argue with, scars that she could not erase, and truths she had never wanted to hear. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. For the first time, she was speechless. I didn't gloat, I didn't smile, and I didn't throw her bitterness back at her. I simply looked her in the eyes and said, "You never asked where I was. You never wanted to know the cost. But this," I gestured to the medals, "this is where I was. This is who I am." The tension in the church broke as people began to murmur, not in disdain, but in respect. An old family friend rose to his feet and said softly, "Your father would be proud." Others nodded. A man I barely recognized, one of my father's colleagues, reached out a hand and whispered, "We had no idea." The room, once filled with suffocating judgment, now hummed with a different energy. Respect. Recognition. Claire stood alone in her silence, her face paling as the truth settled on her shoulders. And in that moment, I realized something important: the slap had been her last weapon. She had thrown it with all the fury of her resentment, but truth is heavier than anger. Truth doesn't bruise, it shatters. And it was her lies, not me, that were crumbling under the weight of what I had revealed. I turned back to my father's coffin, resting a hand gently on the wood, and whispered a private vow only he and I could hear. "I kept the promise, Dad. I lived with honor." When I lifted my head again, the church was no longer just a place of grief. It had become a place of revelation. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a stranger in my own family's story. I felt like the son my father had raised me to be. That's chapter 2, 900 words in one flowing paragraph. Would you like me to continue chapter 3 in the same deep, emotional style, 900 words, or would you prefer I first outline the emotional arc of all 5 chapters so you know how the story builds toward the climax? The service had ended, but the storm inside me was only beginning to calm. People drifted out of the church in hushed groups, some stealing glances at me with newfound respect, others nodding silently as if words would never be enough. My mother lingered by the coffin, her hand pressed against the wood as though she feared letting go would mean losing my father all over again. I wanted to go to her, to comfort her, but I hesitated, my heart heavy with years of distance. For so long, I had been a ghost in this family, present in memory, but absent in flesh, and I wasn't sure if my presence would be a comfort or a wound. Claire stood a few feet away, arms folded tightly across her chest, her face pale, her lips trembling with unspoken rage. She had lost control of the story she had spent years weaving, and I could see in her eyes that she wasn't ready to accept it. For her, the medals were not proof of honor but proof that she had been wrong. And Claire was never the type to accept being wrong. She walked toward me slowly, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her voice low and venomous when she spoke. "You think a few pieces of metal make you a hero? You weren't here. You weren't here when Mom cried at night. You weren't here when Dad got sick. You don't get to stand there with your shiny medals and pretend you're the good son. Her words stung, but not because they were true, they stung because of the bitterness that had twisted her heart for so long. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the toll her resentment had taken. She had built her entire identity around being the one who stayed, the one who carried the weight alone, and my return, my truth, shattered that fragile pride. I could have argued. I could have reminded her that Dad himself had encouraged me to enlist, that he had been proud of my choice, that every letter I received from him carried words of support even when his health was failing. But I didn't. Instead, I let silence hang between us, because I knew no words would change her mind. Some wounds aren't healed with explanations, they are healed only with time, if they heal at all. My silence, however, seemed to infuriate her more, and with a scoff she turned away, muttering loud enough for those nearby to hear, "You'll never change. You'll always be the same selfish boy who left." But the whispers that followed weren't in agreement, they were in defense. I heard someone behind me murmur, "He fought for this country." Another voice said, "That's no boy, that's a soldier." For the first time, the tide was no longer in her favor. I moved toward my mother then, slowly, almost unsure of how to bridge the years between us. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then she reached for my hand, her fingers trembling but firm as they closed around mine. "You came back," she whispered, her voice breaking. Those 3 words pierced deeper than Claire's slap, deeper than any insult I had ever endured, because they carried both accusation and forgiveness, grief and relief. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I never left you, Mom," I said softly, though I knew the truth was more complicated than that. My body had been gone, yes, but my heart had carried them through every mission, every dark night when I wondered if I'd ever see home again. She nodded slowly, tears spilling down her cheeks, and in that moment I felt a piece of the distance between us dissolve. The priest approached then, offering quiet condolences, and others followed, shaking my hand, thanking me for my service, some even embracing me as though I had become a symbol of strength rather than the shame Claire had painted me as. Yet beneath it all, a heaviness remained. I knew the funeral was not the end of this conflict with my sister. Claire's pride was a blade, and though today she had been disarmed, I could see the promise of another strike in her eyes. She was not finished, and perhaps she never would be. But as I looked around at the faces of people who had once doubted me now seeing me clearly, I understood something I hadn't before. I didn't need Claire's approval to validate who I was. My father had known. My mother now knew. And the truth was enough. Still, as we walked out of the church into the bright afternoon, the weight of my father's absence pressed down on me, heavier than any burden I had carried in battle. The sun was warm, the air filled with the scent of lilies from the wreaths, but all I could feel was the hollow space where his voice should have been. I wished he could have been there to see me stand tall, to see me refuse to bow to lies, to see me finally step out of the shadows. But maybe, in some way, he had. Maybe the strength I felt wasn't mine alone but his, guiding me one last time. I stood at the steps of the church, metals still glinting faintly in the sunlight, and I knew this was only the beginning of a reckoning long overdue. Claire could strike again, but I was ready. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of being misunderstood. For the first time, I knew that my silence no longer hid me, it defined me. And from this day forward, I wouldn't run from who I was. I would face it, every scar, every medal, every truth, no matter who it shattered. The days following the funeral were heavy with silence, the kind of silence that settles not because peace has been found, but because battles are still being fought in shadows. My mother stayed quiet most of the time, moving like a ghost through the house, her grief drowning her in ways I didn't know how to reach. Relatives came and went, offering condolences laced with curiosity, their glances at me still tinged with awe from what had been revealed at the church. But beneath all of it, Claire's presence loomed like a storm cloud. She avoided me when she could, and when she couldn't, her eyes burned with the same fury that had driven her to slap me. I could see it, her resentment hadn't lessened. If anything, it had deepened. She had lost her grip on the narrative she had built for years, and the humiliation of that loss was eating her alive. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that silence had been my armor, but there are moments when silence is no longer enough. One evening, after the relatives had left and the house had fallen into a suffocating quiet, Claire cornered me in our father's study. The room still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco, the bookshelves lined with the volumes he loved, and the photograph of him in uniform staring down from the wall. "You think you've proven something," she spat, her arms folded, her jaw tight. "But you don't get to come back here after years and parade your medals like they erase everything. You weren't here when Dad's health was failing. You weren't here when Mom cried herself to sleep. You weren't here, and I was. That's what matters." Her words cut, not because they were true, but because buried within them was a kernel of pain I couldn't ignore. She had been here, carrying the visible burdens, while I carried the invisible ones thousands of miles away. I wanted to tell her that Dad had begged me not to come home early, that he had insisted I finish my service because he believed in me, because he was proud of me, because he wanted one son to live by the very principles he had always preached. But before I could speak, she sneered, "You don't deserve his respect. You don't deserve to be called his son." That was the breaking point. For years, I had swallowed her venom, let her paint me as the failure, let her twist my absence into betrayal. But in that room, under the watchful gaze of my father's photograph, I couldn't let her words stand any longer. I stepped forward. My voice sharp, steady, and louder than it had ever been in her presence. "Don't you dare tell me what I deserve, Claire. You think staying here makes you the stronger one? You think carrying resentment makes you a martyr? While you sat here judging me, I was dragging dying men through sand, holding brothers in my arms as they begged me to tell their families they loved them. I bled for this country. I broke pieces of myself that will never heal. And I did it because Dad raised me to believe honor mattered more than comfort, that sacrifice was the true measure of a man. Don't you dare stand there and tell me I don't deserve to be his son. I lived every day of my service proving that I was." My words thundered through the small room, and for the first time, Claire faltered. Her lips parted, her breath caught, her eyes flickered with something that looked almost like fear. But pride is a dangerous thing, and she quickly straightened, her chin lifting. "You think medals make you better than me," she hissed. I shook my head slowly, the anger still hot in my chest, but tempered with truth. "No," I said firmly. "They don't make me better than you. They remind me of what I gave up, pieces of my body, pieces of my soul. I don't stand here asking you to worship me. I stand here asking you to stop lying about who I am. I am not the disgrace you call me. I am not the failure you've painted me as. I am your brother, and whether you like it or not, I have earned my place in this family." The silence that followed was crushing, the kind of silence where truths linger heavy in the air. Claire's eyes filled with tears, though whether they were from anger, pain, or the faintest crack of realization, I couldn't tell. She turned away sharply, her voice breaking as she muttered, "You'll never understand what it was like for me." And for the first time, I softened. My anger drained, leaving behind a strange ache. "You're right," I said quietly. "I'll never understand what it was like for you. And you'll never understand what it was like for me. But that doesn't mean we have to destroy each other over it." She froze, her back to me, and for a long time neither of us moved. The photograph of our father seemed to watch over us, as though silently urging us to lay down the weapons we had both carried for too long. Finally, Claire whispered, barely audible, "You should have been here." It was not an accusation this time, it was a confession, a wound laid bare. I closed my eyes, swallowing hard. "I wanted to," I admitted. "But Dad wouldn't let me. He told me to finish what I started. He said he was proud." My voice cracked on that last word, and the room went still. Claire didn't turn around. But I saw her shoulders tremble, her pride colliding with her grief in a war she wasn't ready to end. In that moment, I realized this battle between us might never truly be won. But maybe it didn't need to be. Maybe the victory wasn't in breaking each other down, but in finding the strength to stand, side by side, in our own scars and truths. The day of my father's burial arrived with skies so gray, they seemed to mirror the weight pressing on our family. The procession moved slowly toward the cemetery, the crunch of gravel underfoot mixing with the muted sobs of those who followed. The coffin, draped in flowers, seemed lighter than the grief it carried, as though wood and nails could never contain the man my father had been. I walked beside my mother, steadying her when her steps faltered, and though she leaned on me with a quiet trust, I could feel Claire's presence just behind us, her silence thick, her pride still struggling against the truth. The ceremony was brief but piercing. The priest's words floated in the damp air, speaking of legacy, of strength, of sacrifice. And when the time came, I stepped forward with the small wooden box in my hand, the medals that had defined years of my life and now, in this moment, felt like more than my own story. They were a bridge between the father who raised me and the man I had become. I opened the box once more, the metal catching what little light broke through the clouds, and I placed it on top of the coffin. "For you, Dad," I whispered, my voice steady though my chest ached. Every scar, every mile, every breath I fought to keep, it was all because of what you taught me. My mother's hand tightened around mine, her tears spilling freely now, not of shame but of pride, and for the first time in years I felt her truly see me. Around us, relatives lowered their heads, some weeping, others whispering that this was how a son honors his father. But it was Claire I felt most, her silence stretching like a shadow. She stood at the edge of the crowd, her arms no longer crossed, her face pale and wet with tears she tried to hide. For so long she had defined me by absence, but now absence had been replaced with presence too undeniable to ignore. When the coffin was lowered, the ropes creaking softly as the earth prepared to swallow the last physical trace of my father, something inside me broke loose. Not with weakness, but with a release I had held too long. The finality of the moment pressed against me, and I let the tears fall, tears I hadn't allowed myself in deserts or jungles, in barracks or battlefields. They weren't just tears for loss, but for years of silence, for years of carrying a burden no one at home had wanted to understand. I felt a hand touch my shoulder then, hesitant but trembling with sincerity. When I turned, it was Claire. Her eyes were red, her lips trembling as if every word caught in her throat was a battle she wasn't sure she wanted to fight anymore. She didn't speak at first, and I didn't push her. The weight of the moment was enough. Finally, she whispered. Barely audible over the rustle of the wind, I didn't know. It wasn't an apology, not fully, but it was the first crack in the wall she had built. I nodded, my voice low, steady, carrying no anger. You never asked, I replied, and I never told. Maybe that's where we both went wrong. Her tears spilled then, harder this time, and though pride still lingered in her posture, her hand stayed on my shoulder as though she couldn't bear to let go. My mother turned to us, her frail frame trembling with grief and relief, and for the first time since the slap in the church, we stood together, not as enemies, not as rivals, but as the broken pieces of a family trying to mend. The crowd began to disperse, people drifting toward their cars, their heads bowed against the cold wind. But I stayed, standing over the fresh earth, metals gleaming faintly against the dark soil. I thought of my father, of his steady voice. Of the way he would sit on the porch at dusk and tell us stories of perseverance, of integrity, of never letting the world decide who you are. He had lived that truth, and in my own way, so had I. For years I had been silent, thinking my sacrifices were mine alone to carry. But now I understood, silence doesn't always honor the dead, it can bury the living. By showing the truth. By standing tall even in the face of humiliation, I had finally stepped into the light of the man my father believed I could be. Claire lingered a little longer, her arms wrapped around herself, her face softer now, not softened by defeat but by the first hints of understanding. She didn't apologize again, and I didn't ask her to. Some wounds take longer to heal, and some never fully do. But I knew then that the fight between us had changed. No longer fueled only by resentment, it was tempered now by truth. As I turned to leave, walking beside my mother with Claire just a step behind, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. Not a peace that erased pain or loss, but one that acknowledged them, that carried them forward as part of me. My father was gone, but his legacy lived in the metals on his coffin, in the strength of my mother's grip, in the quiet surrender in Claire's touch, and most of all, in the resolve burning in my chest. I had shown them who I truly was, not a disgrace, not a failure, but a son, a brother, a soldier, a man shaped by sacrifice and bound by honor. And as we walked away from the grave, the earth closing over my father's body, I knew this chapter was over. The story of my silence had ended. From here on, my life would be written in truth. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to The Silent Revenge for more powerful stories of justice and payback.